Okay, we are up on recording, and I'm going to mute everyone. So, Lindsay, I'm going to ask you if I can get everybody muted. I will let you unmute yourself, or I can do that for. There you go. You did it. All right, guys. So I'm Melissa Shaver. I am here hosting with my co-host Robin Sullivan, and we are here together to finish out our book club on The Road Back to You. We've got Lindsay O'Connor with us again tonight, who has just graciously given us her time again tonight. She was so great last week that I thought, man, what a bummer if we don't have her to close this out, because she's just so excellent at this work. And so we asked her to come back, and she was gracious enough to say yes. And I'm going to hand it over to her fairly quickly. I will say this before she gets started. Number one, thanks for being on the call. And number two, if you have not finished the book, don't let this slow you down. My biggest concern is that some of our people aren't on the call tonight because they felt like, hey, I kind of fell back a little bit, and so I feel like I can't jump on the call. And this call is going to help anybody and everybody. She's going to go a little bit deeper, I believe, into the stances that she talked about a little bit last week, and help us understand that a little bit more. So with that, Lindsay, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me again. Yes, this work is ongoing. And so there's no really, there's a starting point, and then there's really never an end or arrive. So wherever you are, this will apply to you. So I will talk a little bit. I'll kind of review briefly a few of the things that we talked about last week. And then we're going to go a little more in depth with the stances, and then a little more in depth with each number. To start with, I want to talk about, I realized last week I used the word transformation a couple times, and I wanted to be real clear about what transformation is, and as opposed to change. So Suzanne talks about transformation is lasting, and it has to do with, we talked last week about your personality is the coping mechanisms that you sort of put on in childhood to deal with difficult things and to deal with the brokenness of the world. And so transformation is actually a letting go, a surrendering, and things falling away. And so when transformation happens, we're starting to let go of some of those coping mechanisms that we've been relying on. And that will be a lasting change. A lot of times it's a slow process. It may not be something that you notice overnight, but as you're doing work with Enneagram or other tools, whatever tools you're using for personal growth, over time, you may realize, oh, a long time ago, I would have reacted or responded differently to that. And you may start to begin to see some changes in yourself. So that's transformation, and that's what we're dealing with and what we're after. Change is adding on new information and new learning, and change is good. It's not a bad thing, but it is different than what we're after with Enneagram work. And so sometimes we might read a really great book or go to a conference or watch a movie and say, that was so amazing. I learned so much that changed my life. And then 6 months later, we don't remember a whole lot about it. So the Enneagram can be approached either way, but what we're after is transformation. And so it's really important, as we're gaining all of this intellectual knowledge about it, the goal is not just to understand or know about the Enneagram. The goal is to apply it so that we can have that transformation. So there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done. And it's possible to do a lot of the intellectual work without ever actually experiencing personal, real transformation. And so that's just something to be aware of. Last time we talked about the 3 centers of intelligence being thinking, feeling, and doing. And each number is dominant in one of those areas and repressed in one of those areas. And then you have one that's kind of in the middle. And the stances are a way to group the 9 numbers by we put them in a group based on what is repressed. And so there's the aggressive stance, the dependent stance, and the withdrawing stance. And each stance has 3 numbers that are all repressed in the same area. So I'm going to review that. And then as I'm talking about the specific numbers, I'm going to go in the order of the stances, because there will be some things that apply to all the numbers in that stance, and then there will be some things that are number specific. So the aggressive stance includes 3, 7, and 8, and their repressed feeling. And if it's uncomfortable, if the word repressed is uncomfortable, which it can be, you can think of it as just meaning out of thinking, feeling, and doing, your repressed areas, whatever you have the least natural access to. It's the hardest for you. Of those 3 things, that's the hardest thing for you to access. The dependent stance is 1s, 2s, and 6s, and they're repressed thinking. And the withdrawing stance is 4s, 5s, and 9s, and they're repressed doing. And again, that doesn't mean that we're all thinking and feeling and doing all the time, but it's not always productive or helpful in whatever we are repressed in. So a lot of Enneagram work can be done in the stances with bringing up your repressed center. So we talk about either bringing up thinking, feeling, or doing. And I want to also note that when we are doing this work in a deeply internal and personal way, and when we're after transformation, people that we have been in relationships with for a long time, whether it's work or family or whatever relationships we're in, they love us and they know us for our personality. And so sometimes when we start doing a lot of internal work, there are patterns in our relationships that will start to shift because we are changing. But a lot of times the other people are not changing at the same time or the same speed. And sometimes people don't like that, and sometimes it makes people uncomfortable. And so when we talk about practicing some new thought patterns or new behaviors, it's helpful sometimes to think about practicing it. You don't have to practice these new things with everybody across the board in your whole life. You may want to start out with 1 or 2 safe people or a group of safe people that you trust and that you feel comfortable with, to kind of try on some new behaviors as you're learning, because you want these to be people that are supporting what's best for you, people who really love you and care about your well-being, and not people who are going to get angry and upset that you're not continuing some of the behaviors that you've always done that maybe served the other person well but did not serve you well. Does that make sense? So for example, 9s and 2s are very others referenced. And so 9s are go with the flow and they're easygoing. And when they start doing some work and they start asserting their opinions and what they really want, that's not always fun for the other person who's used to them just going along with what they want to do. 7s are so upbeat and fun and positive, but when they start doing their work and they start letting themselves be in touch a little bit more with grief and sadness, they're not always the life of the party anymore. And sometimes we don't like that. And so just be aware that as you're doing your work for yourself personally, not to feel pressured to have to get it all right with everybody and make huge sweeping changes in your life. To start small and start with safe people. As I talk about the stances, I'm also going to talk about the passion for each number. It talked about that a little bit in the book. Some people in the Enneagram world use the word passion. Some people use the word sin. It's going to be the struggle that is kind of your go-to for your personality, the thing that is difficult for you. So we'll talk about that. And then I also wanted to make a note about boundaries. We talked last time some about 2s having difficulty. 2s were an example that I gave as having difficulty with boundaries and saying no, and making that move to 8 and their stress to help with boundaries. And I wanted to also mention that, I don't remember if I mentioned this last time, depending on your stance and your number, some people have more difficulty with setting boundaries than others. And So having healthy boundaries is not always an indication of personal growth, because for some people it comes really naturally and for other people it doesn't. And when I talk about boundaries in that sense, usually we kind of throw around that word meaning being able to say no when we need to say no, either to people or situations. But I just wanted to point out, this is not Suzanne's teaching. This is just something that I've noticed and is interesting to me. I think it's really interesting to think about different types of boundary setting for different numbers and stances. And if you, this is kind of the textbook go-to that a lot of people in the Christian world use. It's just called Boundaries, and it's by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And it's an excellent, excellent book. It's one that I've returned to multiple times, and I've done it with groups and heard different teachings on it. It's really helpful. But one of the things they talk about in this book is that boundaries involve letting in the good and keeping out the bad. And so there are different types of boundary struggles, and the inability to say no is one of those. And 1s, 2s, and 6s have a hard time with that. And that's for sure something they have to work on. But there are other boundary problems, and I know this is getting a little off topic, but I just wanted to touch on this just to be thinking about it in the context of your number. So they list 4 kind of categories of boundary problems. One is the compliant. Those are people who have trouble saying no. One is the non-responsive. They have trouble saying yes, as in they have trouble stepping up to take responsibility to love people well, to do whatever they need to do to love people in an appropriate way. There are some people called the controller who have trouble hearing no. In other words, they have difficulty respecting somebody else's no. So they may have their own agenda and they kind of plow over people, either intentionally or not, but they don't pay attention to other people's no. And then there's the avoidant. And these are people who have difficulty receiving care and help from other people. So they have trouble letting in the good. So I just wanted to point that out, because as we go through the numbers and as you think about your own number, you'll realize that there may be 1 or 2 of those areas that are more difficult for you, and that will be the area that you want to focus on. We don't all have the same boundary work that we need to do, if that makes sense. Any questions so far?
I do have one quick question just to make sure everybody got the stances. You had aggressive, dependent, and what was your third one?
Oh, withdrawing.
Withdrawing.
And that is 4, 5, and 9.
Okay. And then you're going to go over the passions or the sins here in a minute?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a quick question, Lindsay. Sure. Those last things that you were just telling us about, non-responsive, controller, avoidant, what was the first one?
Compliant.
Compliance. And which numbers fit with those, or does that matter?
For sure, the compliant would be 1s, 2s, and 6s. That's kind of the traditional boundary setting that we think of. The other ones I'm not really sure. I think it could depend. I think the controller would probably tend to be the aggressive stance. People who have trouble, and we'll talk about it more when I talk about stances, but people who have more trouble being aware of or informed by other people's agendas. People in the aggressive stance are more oriented to their own agenda. So they're going to be less likely to be in tune with someone else's no, probably, not necessarily. And then the avoidant, they have trouble receiving care. I would say 2s for sure, because 2s have trouble letting people help them. And then possibly the withdrawing stance, which would be 4, 5, and 9, because 4s, 5s, and 9s rely on themselves a lot, and they work things out internally in their heads, and they need to learn to reach out and let people help them. And that, again, those are my own thoughts from the Boundaries book. That's not Suzanne's teaching, so you can, take that with a grain of salt.
Thanks.
Sure. Anything else? All right, let's start with the aggressive stance. The aggressive stance does not necessarily mean that these people are aggressive in the sense that we normally talk about being aggressive. The aggressive stance, including 3s, 7s, and 8s, these are people who we talk about either moving away from or towards people or independently of. People in the aggressive stance move independently of or against other people. And that just means that they have their own agenda and their own ideas about what needs to be done and their own goals and plans, and that is how they're orienting themselves. They believe strongly in their ability to change the world, change their environment, or just make a difference in whatever context they're in. They're future-oriented, so they're always thinking ahead to what's coming. And like I said last week, they're repressed feeling, and that just means that they're not always in touch with their own feelings or other people's feelings, or they may not be using that information to make a decision about what to do. And each of these, when I go through the stance, I will give a tip for something you can work on that applies to all the numbers in that stance, and then I'll give some tips that will be specific to one number. So one of the things Suzanne talks about with the aggressive stance is it's helpful sometimes in order to bring up feeling. So people in the aggressive stance are sometimes uncomfortable with the vulnerability of some of the more tender feelings, either in themselves or other people. And so sometimes it's helpful to put yourself in a situation on a regular basis where it's sort of impossible to ignore vulnerable feelings. So an example would be like volunteering at a children's hospital, or working with homeless people, or working with really vulnerable people, so that you're kind of staring vulnerability in the face, and that's a way to practice bringing up feeling. Now I'll talk a little bit specifically about each number in the aggressive stance. We'll start with 3s. 3s, like I mentioned last week, notice feelings, but they tend to set them aside because feelings block efficiency. And so 3s will notice them, set them aside, and move on. And sometimes they circle back to the feelings to deal with them, and sometimes they kind of move on because there's not time. 3s need to learn to let their feelings inform their decisions sometimes when it's appropriate, whether it's your own feelings or the feelings of others. That would be true for 7s and 8s as well. Sometimes, because 3s are moving so fast and they're so goal-oriented, and as soon as they finish one goal, they're moving on to the next. So sometimes they end up with kind of a backlog of feelings that they haven't dealt with, and they need to pay attention to that when there needs to be time set aside to kind of circle back and deal with either their feelings or in a relationship, maybe with somebody else's. 3s need to realize and understand that their real, authentic feelings are valuable, and sharing those feelings will be helpful in their relationships. And like I said, you don't have to practice that with every person in every relationship. You want to start with 1 or 2 safe people that you feel comfortable being vulnerable with. And for all of us, when we're practicing these things that are really unnatural for us, it can be kind of awkward and messy and uncomfortable at first, and that's okay. That's just part of the practice. The passion for 3s is deceit, and that does not mean deceiving other people. It really refers to the fact that 3s are quickly reading in a context and a group of people what is desired and trying to adapt to that image. And so sometimes they are doing that so often. They're changing hats so often. They're very good at stepping into a context, very quickly reading the situation and adapting themselves to fit that context. And they can be in one place and do it and then step into another situation and kind of very quickly change hats. And sometimes they're doing that so quickly and so often that they lose touch with who they are under all of that. They lose touch with their authentic feelings, desires, and just who they really are. And so the deceit is more of a self-deceit in not being in touch with their authentic selves. 3s believe that they kind of have an underlying belief that if I become who you want me to be, then I'll be successful. And their sense of self-worth is tied to what they're accomplishing. And so they're trying to accomplish well so that they can be loved. But with all of the passions are making a promise that they really can't deliver on. And so if a 3 continues to achieve and achieve and achieve, and that gets rewarded and reinforced, it's reinforcing the idea that, yes, I love you, and yes, you're worthy because you're achieving all these things. When what the 3 really wants deep down is to know that they're loved for who they are, apart from what they can do. And so Suzanne teaches that a lot of times for 3s specifically, it takes a really big failure of some sort before they can get to that place of, you have to get to a point where the achieving isn't working anymore before you can learn that your self-worth is not tied to your success. 7s we talked about, they're in that half range of emotion. So last week we talked about how if this is really, really happy and this is really, really depressed, 7s only want to go to here. Anytime they start to feel a little bit of a negative emotion, they quickly want to get out of that and reframe it as fast as possible. And so that's why they're feeling repressed, because they're not really acknowledging or dealing with the negative feelings. And in order to do that, they do something that's called reframing. I can't remember if we talked about that last week, but reframing is when they take a situation that is uncomfortable or that they don't like, and they figure out a way to sort of spin it, put a positive spin on it, so that, it doesn't seem as bad as they thought. Because they don't want to be, 7s have a real fear of being stuck in either pain or boredom or uncomfortable emotions. And so when something painful comes up, they're going to be really quick to look at the bright side, find the silver lining, and then go with that and kind of forget about the thing that was uncomfortable. So part of the work for 7s, a big part of the work, is going to be learning to acknowledge those uncomfortable emotions, especially grief. 7s are so good and so quick at reframing that a lot of times, just like I talked about the 3 having a big failure, 7s often will need to encounter a crisis that is big enough that it can't be reframed. So something that happens that there's really no bright side, there's no way, something that is so difficult, there's no way to find the silver lining. And when that happens, a lot of times all of the things, all of the small things that the 7 has not grieved prior to that point, there's sort of a domino effect. And all of that grief sort of comes bubbling up to the surface, and it's really overwhelming. And 7s, when that happens, really need to have someone to help them process that grief, because it's a lot to deal with at once. Their passion is gluttony, and that refers to the 7's need for lots of experiences. It's kind of a gluttony of experiences. They want to try everything. They want to always be moving on to the next big thing, the next exciting thing. And their they're future oriented, just like the other numbers in the aggressive stance. And they're always looking forward to the next exciting thing. And they're always making plans, to the point that it's hard for them to be present and to find satisfaction in the present moment. And so some of their work is going to be around learning to be present and learning to appreciate what's really happening right now, instead of needing to anticipate something great in the future. And a lot of so I'm looking at the comments here, and someone's saying ouch. And I also meant to preface all of this with, the deeper we get into this, as I was, going over my notes before this talk, I thought, oh my gosh, everyone's going to hate me. So none of this is fun to hear about yourself. And it's okay. And I love you. We all love you. You can love yourself. We all have our stuff. So just hang in there. I know it's hard. It's hard for me too. 8s we'll do next. So 8s are feeling repressed. They're not really noticing or paying a lot of attention to feelings, and 8s are really uncomfortable with vulnerability. They have a need to appear strong and in control of themselves. And so it's uncomfortable for them to either receive or express the more vulnerable, tender emotions. And a lot of times 8s confuse their intensity and their passion with feelings. And 8s need to learn to distinguish between intensity and feelings. So they may be expressing a lot of intense passion about something. When 8s are in, they are all in. They're working really hard. They're all the way there. They're doing their best. They give 150% to everything. And that's intense. And to an 8, that seems like feelings, but it's different than feelings. 8s need to learn that vulnerability is strength. They have a tendency to see vulnerability as weakness, and they have a need to appear to be strong. And they need to realize that vulnerability takes courage and takes strength. And they need to learn to express how much they care about the people who are close to them. Again, this is not something that they need to do with everybody in every part of their lives, but the few people that are close to them, the 8s can learn to express how much they care, and also 8s can work on learning to receive that from other people who are close to them. For those of us who are in a relationship of some sort with an 8, we also need to be aware that feelings are difficult and exhausting for 8s. And so we just need to pay attention to how much we're expecting in kind of emotional interactions with an 8, and just be mindful of the fact that what is normal for us might be really draining and difficult for people with a different personality. 8s, also another tip for 8s is they need to learn to listen to and honor other people's ideas and suggestions. 8s are very comfortable being the leader. They have a lot of confidence in themselves. They're much of the time sure that they're right. They're quick thinkers. They're smart. They process really quickly. They're intuitive. And a lot of times their gut feeling is correct. So that gets reinforced a lot. And so because of that, it seems inefficient to slow down enough to listen to other people who disagree, because they think they can quickly assess a situation. They're great problem solvers, so they quickly can problem solve. And they're comfortable doing it. They're comfortable stepping up and being the one to take charge. But what they need to realize is that sometimes they lose buy-in from the people that they're trying to lead by always plowing ahead and not stopping to listen and consider another point of view. So they need to learn that there's value in collaboration, even though collaboration is inefficient and it does slow things down, but there is value in that sometimes. The passion for 8s is lust, and that refers to intensity in everything they do, just like I talked about at the beginning with the 8s. They're very intense, they're all in, And sometimes they need to pay attention to when they're reacting to things instead of responding. Because of that intensity, they don't realize that for other people who don't see the world the same way they do, that intensity can be really overwhelming and kind of overbearing. So that's something to pay attention to. We're going to move to the dependent stance. Are there any questions about the aggressive stance before we move on? Okay. The dependent stance is 1s, 2s, and 6s. And the word dependent does not necessarily mean that these people are codependent or dependent on other people. They may be, but not necessarily. Dependent refers to the fact that these people are dependent on the situation that's happening in the moment to decide what needs to be done. So just like we talked about the aggressive stance, they're oriented to their own agenda. People in the dependent stance are looking to the situation to see what needs to be done. And like everything, there's good and bad to that. So 1s, 2s, and 6s can make a plan for their day, for their week, for their year. They might have a plan and an agenda, but it quickly and over again gets derailed, because when they see a need, either in a person or a situation, something that needs to be done, the way that these people see the world is they automatically think that it's my job to fulfill that need. And that's not even a conscious thought. That's just, without even thinking, they're going to immediately try to fulfill that need. And because of that, they might start out the day with their plan, but as soon as a need arises, they kind of veer off to meet that need. And sometimes that makes it difficult for them to stick with the plan. And that's why boundaries are difficult for them. It's difficult for them to say no, because intuitively they believe that it's their job to fulfill whatever needs pop up. So boundaries are a big part of the work for 1s, 2s, and 6s. Boundaries in the sense of learning to distinguish what is actually my responsibility, what is mine to do, and to be able to say no to the things or the people that are not your responsibility. Suzanne quotes somebody, and I can't remember who it is that she's quoting, but it might be Richard Rohr, I'm not sure, but she quotes somebody who says that opinions are underdeveloped thinking. So 1s, 2s, and 6s are thinking repressed, which means they are not always thinking productively, and they tend to be opinionated, and a lot of their opinions are strong opinions that they have held for a long time without re-examining or adjusting them. So 1s, 2s, and 6s need to learn to re-examine some of their own opinions that they haven't. These are maybe messages that they absorbed from the environment, from other people, or even opinions they themselves formed. Sometimes we need to go back and revisit our thoughts on things and reevaluate and be willing to make a change and be willing to listen to people who have different opinions. So some tips for people for all three numbers in the dependent stance would be working on boundaries, also reading nonfiction books by people who have a different opinion or belief than you do. So it's good for them to practice learning from people who have different ideas and different opinions, and not just reading it, but trying to read it open to what they have to say without judgment. And then another practice, this can be used for all numbers, but it's especially helpful for the dependent stance. There's a practice called morning pages that Suzanne talks about, where when you wake up in the morning, as soon as you have a few minutes to yourself, whether that's first thing or sometime in the morning when you have some time, you get 3 pages of paper, and the goal is to keep writing kind of a stream of consciousness on the paper without picking up your pen until you have filled the 3 pages. So You're not editing, you're not correcting, you're not thinking through, you're just writing whatever is in your mind until you fill up 3 pages. And then when you finish, you wad it up and throw it in the trash. Because people in the dependent stance, we tend to wake up in the morning already with all of this unproductive thinking. And it looks different for each number. For 1s, it's going to be that self-critic voice. For 6s, it's going to be worst case scenario planning, preparing for all the bad things that might happen. For 2s, it's going to be all relationship oriented. And so it's helpful in the morning to just kind of get all of that out and dump it and trash it. And then that leaves room for productive thinking. Now we'll talk about each number specifically. We'll start with 1s. So 1s have unproductive thinking because they have that relentless inner critic who is constantly shaming, berating them, criticizing them. There's a voice in their minds that's constantly saying, you did this wrong, you should have done this better, you're a terrible person, why did you do it that way? And it's on and on, continual. And all of that thinking is not productive. That's keeping them from having more productive thoughts about other things. So the morning pages is helpful with that. Another thing that's helpful is, it sounds really odd, but Suzanne talks about naming your critic. Find a name, probably a name that you don't like, for your critic. And people who are in relationships with 1s are in a relationship with the 1, the person, and also with the inner critic. So it's almost like having a third person in the relationship because it's so present for the 1. And so if you can name your critic and tell, again, not everybody you know, but that one person that is a safe person, whether it's your spouse or a close friend or a family member, and tell them the name of your critic, that becomes a way to distinguish between what are your thoughts and what's coming from that critic, and a way for you and whoever the partner is that you're sharing with to tell yourself and remind yourself that those thoughts coming from the critic are not always true and they're not always helpful. And if you are in a relationship with a 1, it's helpful for you to be able to do that with them and say, whatever the critic's name is, Bertha is really telling you that you did a terrible job, but we know that's not true. You don't need to listen to that. 1s tend to have dualistic thinking. They're kind of black and white thinkers. They believe there's a right and a wrong way. And so sometimes they're so focused on perfection and doing things correctly that can stifle originality and creativity. So another thing that 1s can work with is cultivating uniqueness instead of perfection, and learning to appreciate rather than judge. So like when we talked about reading books or talking with people who have different opinions than you, and learning to appreciate a different point of view instead of needing to judge it. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, but you can validate and appreciate it. The 1's passion is anger, and the anger shows up in a 1 more like resentment. So 1s believe that anger it's not good to be angry, and so they'll suppress it. And they also have a lot of frustration. They're constantly noticing everything that is imperfect in the world, and there's a lot of imperfection in the world. And so that leads to a lot of frustration. So they have a lot of anger, but they also think it's not good to be angry. So they stuff it down and stuff it down and stuff it down until it becomes too much. And just like a pressure cooker, it explodes. And they'll have these kind of explosive outbursts. And often the thing that triggers the explosion is not actually what they're angry about. So something that's helpful for 1's, 2 things around anger is to be able to acknowledge and name your anger so that you can move past it. Because as long as you're stuffing it down, it doesn't go away. So if you can acknowledge when you're angry and verbalize and say, I'm angry. And then also, if you can, when you have those explosions, when you have calmed down, if you go back and think, is that what I was really angry about? And think through, was I really angry about the thing that triggered that, or was there maybe something else that I need to deal with? 2s, we'll move on. It looks like, I feel like I'm going too slow here. Speed up a little bit. 2s are not productive thinking because they are mostly thinking about relationships, and there are other important things that they need to be thinking about. So they need to learn to get in touch with their own feelings and needs. Last week we talked about how they easily feel other people's feelings. And so an important part of work for the 2 is going to be getting alone so that you're not distracted by other people's feelings and needs. So spending time alone with some kind of spiritual practice, whether that would be centering prayer or meditation, and then also journaling. But there's a caveat to the journaling. Your journaling has to be only about you and your thoughts and feelings and needs, because your temptation will be to journal about other people. The 2's passion is pride. And this shows up in the sense that 2s want to help everybody else, and they're sensing everybody's needs, but they don't want to acknowledge their own needs. And they think that everyone needs help but themselves. So a lot of the work for the 2s, like I said, is going to be learning to name their own needs and also asking directly for their needs to be met, because when 2s don't ask directly, sometimes they end up manipulating other people, and it's not intentional, and a lot of times they're not aware of it, but they will try to get those needs met in indirect ways because they know how to meet everybody else's needs without having to be asked. And it makes sense to them that other people should be able to meet their needs without them having to ask. But what they don't realize is the rest of us aren't so clued in and intuitive in sensing needs. And so we need the 2s in our lives to be direct about what they need and what they want. 2s believe that if they help others, they'll be loved. But what they really need to understand is that they're just similar to the 3s, that they are loved for who they are, not for what they're doing or what they're giving to other people. And so sometimes if you are a 2, when you notice yourself giving, and actively looking for people to help, that sometimes is a red flag that you have some needs that need to be met, that you need to pay attention to, because you may be looking to get other people's appreciation because your love tank is kind of low and you have some needs that need to be met. We'll move on to 6s. We talked about 6s are worst case scenario planners. They think that the world is a dangerous place, so they want to protect themselves and others that they love by preparing for all the bad things that might happen. So some practices for 6s. They need to spend some time journaling, and specifically journaling about what are all the things that you have worried about that never came to pass, and realizing how much time you spend worrying about things that never happen. And then also journaling and having people in your life to remind you of your past successes. 6s tend to forget all the times that they encountered a difficult situation and they handled it well. And so they need to make a habit of reminding themselves and surrounding themselves with people who will remind them, remember when this other difficult thing happened and you handled it well, and you can handle it again. So they can learn to trust themselves. Their passion is fear, which is more accurately described as anxiety, like we talked about, worrying about possible future events. And 6s have an underlying belief that if they are aware of and plan for everything that could go wrong, they'll be safe. And just like all the passions, that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where they are aware of things, they're planning for it, and then nothing goes wrong, and they think, oh, that planning really worked, and it reinforces them, so they get in this loop of feeling like they always need to plan and prepare because it worked so well the last time. So 6s need to realize that when they encounter something that they haven't planned for, they can still handle it, or reach out and get support from people who will help them. As 6s practice trusting other people that will help them be able to trust themselves. Okay, we're going to move on to the withdrawing stance. And I'm going to go through the withdrawing stance, and then I'll ask for questions after that, because I want to make sure that we get through everybody's numbers. The withdrawing stance includes 4s, 5s, and 9s. And withdrawing means that they move away from people in the sense that they believe in their own ability to work things out internally. They don't reach out a lot for help and support. And they are repressed doing because they don't believe that what they do has much impact on the world. And so they don't do things because they don't think it matters that much anyway, that they don't think that they have that much of an influence on what's going to happen. So Suzanne talks about how the way that you develop perseverance and confidence is through doing. And so for these numbers that are doing repressed, they are lacking in those areas. And the only way to get perseverance and confidence is by practicing doing. They need to learn to bring up doing, and they need to learn healthy interdependence on people. So we've talked about boundaries in a couple different ways. For people in the withdrawing stance, the boundary issue is going to be not letting other people in and not letting other people help and not reaching out when they need something. And so they need to learn that they can reach out for help without that being unhealthy or codependent. 4s are in the withdrawing stance, and they love to be crafting imaginative kind of ideas in their minds. They're very much in their minds. They're very imaginative and creative. They love creative expression, and they like things to be kind of extreme. When they experience an emotion, they like to go deep into that emotion and to experience either art or music or books or things that are going to draw them deeper into that emotion. So they're living in these extremes, and they sometimes have difficulty with the ordinary, boring, mundane tasks that need to be done in everyday life. And so some of the work for 4s will be learning to find the beauty in the ordinary. 4s are drawn to beauty and texture and things that are unique and interesting. And they need to learn how to look for what is beautiful in the ordinary, because there are ordinary things every day that need to be done. Their passion is envy, and that means for 4s, they believe that there is something fundamental that is missing in themselves that other people have. And they are envious of the way that other people seem to have an easier time in the world, that other people seem to belong more easily in the world. And 4s believe that they need to be unique to be understood and to be seen for who they are. And they have this fear of abandonment. Last week we talked about the push-pull that 4s do because of their fear of abandonment. But they need to learn that they are enough just as they are, and that they are lovable, and that they're not missing anything, that they have everything that they need to be worthy and to be enough. 5s spend a lot of energy observing more than participating in life. We talked last week about how 5s have this measured amount of energy. It's the same every day, whether it's this much or this much, depending on the person. Whatever that amount is, it's the same every day. And 5s, even as children, intuitively are very aware of their amount of energy that they have for a day. And they spend a lot of time trying to manage that so that they don't bottom out and they don't completely run out of energy before the day is over or when they still have responsibilities. So fives need alone time. They need to be able to withdraw when they've bottomed out. But they also need to learn that in managing that limited amount of energy, they think about how much energy it's going to cost them to have social interactions of any sort, whether it's physical or emotional or conversations or whatever it is. They're constantly managing how much that's going to cost them, but they need to remember and to realize that they also can gain something from those social interactions. Fives have a strong need to be independent. They fear being dependent on other people. And so they need to realize that everybody needs people. And if they don't practice healthy interdependence on other people, then they may come to a time or a season of life, either when they get old or when they're in a situation, if they get an injury or if something happens in life where they're forced to depend on other people, it's going to be really, really hard if they've never practiced that in smaller steps. So fives need to practice letting other people in, letting other people help them. Their passion is avarice or greed. And that is related to a scarcity mentality, just like with that measured amount of energy. They believe that their own resources are very limited and there's not enough. And so they're constantly trying to manage that. Nines are also in the withdrawing stance. Nines are, they believe that their presence doesn't matter, that it doesn't make much difference whether they are here or not in a given situation. And so they don't think that what they do is going to make much of a difference, and they're avoiding conflict both internally and externally. So they don't want to say anything that's going to cause conflict for other people, and they also don't want to let anything in that's going to cause conflict internally for themselves. So they sometimes have some kind of numbing strategies or things that they do, or they may just kind of mentally check out when they feel like that inner peace is going to be threatened. And sometimes that leads to what we call merging, which is when the nine may have a strong preference or need or desire, but they set it aside because they believe that other people's needs are more important, and they'll go along with the other person because they want to avoid conflict. And what they need to realize is that the avoidance of conflict can cause conflict. So for those of us in a relationship with a nine, when nines go along with everything and don't want to rock the boat, at some point that avoidance of conflict causes a problem. So nines need to learn to practice asserting themselves and saying what they want and what they need, and learning that doing that up front sometimes is actually more effective in avoiding conflict than setting things aside and not dealing with them. What can be difficult for nines and in a relationship with a nine is nines genuinely don't care a lot of the time. So you might ask them where they want to go for dinner and they actually don't care. They're not being passive aggressive a lot of the time. They just don't care. And since most of the rest of us are more opinionated, we have trouble realizing that. And so sometimes it's hard to distinguish when a nine really doesn't care and when they're merging with you and setting aside what they really want. So nines need to learn to pay attention to that in themselves and speak up when they realize that they're merging. I was talking to someone at an Enneagram event that I was at who's a nine, and he was saying that he has developed this language he uses with his wife. He said usually he doesn't realize in the moment when he's merging, but maybe at the end of the day and looking back throughout the day, he'll realize that he kind of went along with something that he didn't want to. And so he'll say to his wife, when I said I didn't really care if we went out to that party or not, I think I was bad merge. He says bad merging. And so sometimes it's hard for nines to realize it in the moment, but if they can just start paying attention and being aware of when that's happened, even if it happened earlier in the day, and helping the people who love you to recognize that. And the people who are in relationships with nines, we need to work on when a nine does assert what they want, we really need to pay attention and honor that, because it's so easy to convince them to go along with what we want, and they will concede and they'll do what we want, but that's not honoring to a nine who has summoned up the energy that it takes to assert themselves. I think we will stop there. I know we're just about out of time. I'll let y'all decide how much time we have left for questions.
Yeah, guys, if y'all have any questions, Lindsay, thank you so much. If y'all have any questions, you can put it into the chat. I do have a question, and I will say, hearing you talk about sevens was huge for me. I'm not a seven, but I have a child who is. And whenever you talked about the thing, you know, that they reframe all the time, that there's going to have to be a crisis big enough that it can't be reframed.
Mm-hmm.
And my daughter went through a death of a best friend, and it couldn't be reframed. You're right. And she really had to deal with the grief, but it did bring out all this other stuff. And it was about a year of working through grief. And so even hearing you say that was so helpful to understand that is what she was going through, and how the Lord brought people around her to help her work through different situations. So that was really cool. But I do have a question. And then if you guys, I see a couple of questions, but I have a question, and we didn't even talk about this, but I want to make sure for all of us that are reading the book Between Stresses versus Securities, that we understand the arrows, and it goes more into the path between us. But if I'm correct to say, at one point I thought that whenever your arrow for a stress, like my arrow, I'm a 3, so my stress would go to a 9. I almost took it that it meant that it went to the negative side of a 9, but what I'm starting to understand from continuing to read is that it actually, whenever I'm in a stress mode, it goes to the good side of 9 that helps me deal with the stress. Is that like to cope? So it actually, okay.
So it can go either way. Usually if we're on autopilot, or when we're younger and less mature and we haven't done as much work, we're gonna go to the lower side of that stress number. But as we mature and we grow and we do more personal work, then we learn how to choose to go to that healthier side, and it does help you. Absolutely.
It helps you cope. Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's see. Can you go back and forth between numbers? That's what one person is asking.
So your core number is not going to change, and your core number is based on your motivation, but you definitely can go back and forth. You're bouncing around between your stress number, your security number, and your core number. But when you move to that stress number or security number, you're not becoming that other number. You're just picking up some of those behaviors. So your core number does not change, but you're definitely moving depending on how stressed or not you are.
Okay. And then I know that speaking to several different people over the past week, many people they've read the book, they're still trying to figure out their own number. What would be your encouragement to them as they continue to figure out, I think I'm between these 3 numbers or these 2 numbers? What can they do to really kind of be able to say, okay, this is it. This is my number?
There's a couple really great resources. There is a guy on Facebook. He's actually one of the teachers for the cohort I'm in. Hunter Mobley. It's Mobley. He's on Facebook. I think he's on Instagram too. And he does these 10-minute short videos, and it will tell you on the title of the video, a lot of them are distinguishing. He'll talk about distinguishing between 2 specific numbers. So you can look on his Facebook page, and he's really, really helpful with that. You can also, Suzanne teaches a Know Your Number workshop where she goes through in a lot of depth all the 9 numbers. And that's available on the website on Life in the Trinity Ministry. But what's cool about that is if you don't want to buy that whole workshop, they've made it now to where you can buy the numbers individually. So I think each session is like 20 or 30 minutes for each number. And so if you're between 2 numbers, you could just go and purchase those 2 specific numbers. So it wouldn't cost as much. And that is super helpful.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you can go to, and I'm assuming you said lifeinthetrinityministry.com.
Yes.
Okay.
To make sure. I think it's .com. Let me see.
And then are you saying that the workshop is an in-person workshop, or the workshop is something that you buy and you watch a video?
It's in person, but they have audio recordings. So she does them in person all over the country, and you can look on their website at the events page to see where she's going to be when. But they also have the audio recordings. You can purchase a CD or an MP3 on her website.
Okay. Yeah. So guys, I will put that on our Facebook page. And I'll also see if there's any workshops that are going to be happening in the Metroplex in the next several months. So I'll put that out there as well.
There's also right now, the thing that I was at tonight, actually, the first Tuesday of every month here in Dallas, they're having an Enneagram and parenting class that's taught by Suzanne's daughter and her husband. And it's $3 each time you go, and you can go to one of them or all of them. So you don't, if you haven't been and you want to go, it's fine. They've had 2 so far. And that's on their website as well.
On that same website?
Yes.
And then it's the first Tuesday of each month. Do they go through one number each time, or do they go through all of it, or how does that look?
So the first meeting she talked about, when they talk about kids, they do it by stances, because they say sometimes with younger kids, it's hard to know for sure, but you can narrow down the stance. Mm-hmm. So the first meeting, they talked about kids from each stance and what they might need from you as a parent. Tonight, they talked about for each number, whatever your number is as the parent, things that you need to pay attention to in parenting. And then I believe the next 3 meetings, they're going to do like one on the aggressive stance, one on each stance. So the next meeting, I think, is the aggressive stance.
Okay. And Marquita, yeah, that's Hunter Mobley. So you have that right. Mobley.
Yes.
All right, guys, do y'all have any other questions before we let Lindsay go? Okay, if you end up having questions, make sure you can ask Robin or you can ask myself, and I can get in touch with Lindsay, and I'm sure she could answer some of those things for us. Lindsay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was writing so fast, but I'm thankful that we have it recorded, and I am going to stop